Dion?
Dion worked as a youth coordinator at a substance abuse treatment program. I was Dion's supervisor. All of the young people that were employed at the Kids Safe Zone had backgrounds very similar to the children that we were serving.
There you go, Superman.
Dion had his bout with substance use and unemployment and undereducation and the other things that plagued that community. He was serious about recovery and changing the way that he lived.
This is for you. What is that right there?
And he asked on several occasions if we could consider him working with us because of the amount of times that he had come through the program and was familiar with everyone. It was a perfect fit. It was impossible to be in his space and not smile. And he walked into the door, the kids would light up. I don't think I've ever seen Dion any happier than when he was working with the children.
Why? Why?
That's right. That's right.
I think he paid them. Did you pay those children?
His most important role was that of a father. He had a set of twins and an older child, but he wanted to be a dad that provided the things that kids wanted. He wanted his kids to have some of the things that he didn't have.
I don't know nobody that's thinking all the time about their kids. If he had free time, it was free time for his kids. Dion wanted to do the right thing. He was transitioning into a better person. Hey, catch you later.
See you later.
You too, dummy.
Future was looking very bright for Dion.
This Baltimore City 911, yes, sir, got up your emergency. You need to hurry and come again here. My son said somebody murdered in the room. Hello? Ma'am? Oh my God, I am so scared right now. Oh my God, Dion! Oh my God, it's blood. It's blood everywhere. Do it look like you've been shot, ma'am? Yes.
On July 2nd, 2017, at approximately 7:35 p.m., a call was made to the fire department from Argyle Avenue. Initial information stated that a man was on the floor bleeding and not breathing.
The Baltimore City Fire Department immediately dispatched medical personnel to the scene.
Baltimore PD also sends an officer.
Upon entering the first floor front bedroom, the officer located the body of an adult male with a gunshot wound to the head.
Medical staff quickly assessed that the victim had deceased. Our patrol division right away knew that this was going to be a call for the homicide unit, and that's when we were notified.
Upon entering the victim's room, I noticed the room to be in disarray. I noticed the victim to be laying on the ground on his back. He was wearing tan shorts, a white t-shirt, and tennis shoes. He had blood around his head, blood spatter around him. The wound on the side of the victim's head indicated that it was a large caliber gun. There was no cell phone, there was no murder weapon, so there really wasn't a lot of evidence within this room.
It almost looked like there were signs of a struggle. The interior of the residence was a little messy. He was near a couch that had been pulled away from the wall, and in his hand he had some money. Maybe it was a robbery gone bad, or maybe somebody tried to burglarize his residence, but it was odd that he had money in his hand. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no damage to the front door, the door jamb. So this was possibly somebody that either lived there or was, the victim was comfortable with.
Located inside the room was the victim's backpack and wallet with his identification inside.
We got ID.
The ID belongs to 25-year-old Dion Smith.
So we need to notify next of kin. That's a priority for us. It's going to be emotional. Their loved one is now deceased, and not just deceased, but been murdered.
Hello?
I remember getting a call and being told Dion was gone. And
What?
I remember my breath being taken away. Just in thinking our city and the violence, and now it was this close to home.
Everything that I was dreaming of at that time shattered.
We'd watched Dion grow up, and we'd watched him finally come into who, he wanted to be, and then to think that Dion's gone means that his kids won't ever see him again. It's senseless. He was so special, and such a sweet, kind soul gone.
It's critically important for us to find witnesses that might talk to the police right after the incident occurred.
Paulette Richardson, one of the residents, provided information about what had occurred earlier.
I'm a detective and I'm assigned to the homicide unit. I'm here to speak to you in reference to a death that one of my partners is out investigating in Argyle Avenue.
Paulette was inside her room on the second floor, and her son, Dexter, ran into her bedroom screaming, "Call the police."
And I'm like, why? You like, some guy, he said Dion is dead. And I'm like, what you mean? He said he did.
At that time, Paulette Richardson called 911. Although she didn't witness the incident, she was still nervous as to any repercussions about giving information to the police.
People are very reluctant to come forward and talk to the police because there's an element of danger there. There might be some retaliation that they may experience from the bad guys.
But that's too much information. No, no. Talk to me. No. Talk to me. No, wait. No.
There's a phrase in Baltimore, snitches get stitches.
What's your first name again? Dexter Richardson Jr.
Paulette's son Dexter was brought into the homicide office and interviewed.
I wake up around like 7, took a shower. That's when my mother and her friend knocked on my door, gave me my $8. And at that point, I said, where everybody at? She said she don't know. She went upstairs.
Dexter comes out of his room and notices that Dion's door is open.
So I peeped in the room, and when I peeped in the room, I seen like dry blood on the floor. Like I didn't peep really around that. I seen his arm.
Dexter tells us that while he's discovered the body, he hears a tap at the window.
He went around to the front door and opened the door, and a man wearing a gray t-shirt entered the dwelling.
He a type of person I want to hang with. Like, he look dirty. Junkie? No, not like haircut, not cut. Like, just one of them people you be like, nah, I don't want to hang with him. Sketchy, just kind of uneasy around.
Dexter and this man walked towards the hallway of Dion's room, and this man told Dexter, "I think something's wrong with Dion."
That's when I ran upstairs and told everybody else.
By the time Dexter comes back downstairs, this man is gone. He had left the residence.
Do you know his nickname? Or street name? Real name? I don't even know this person.
At this point in the investigation, I have a dead body, I don't have a murder weapon, I have a 911 call, and I have 2 potential witnesses. I have no idea who committed this crime. I noticed a security camera in the hallway mounted to the ceiling, pointed to the front door, and then another camera on the 3rd floor.
We know we're going to get absolute facts from that if the image is captured. And we were able to reach out to the landlord of the building and get access to that video.
Dion was managing the property for me. I tell a detective from Baltimore City, say, hey, y'all can have the cameras. I'll give you all the cameras, give you every code you need, whatever you need.
The landlord provided me the name and password of the security system, and we were able to review the video footage.
Yeah, I'm with him now. Okay, it's W0RD.
I'm in.
Okay, thank you. We're in.
Started at 7 p.m.
The first thing we want to do is corroborate the 911 caller as well as the witness statements. While watching the video, I see that Dexter is in the hallway, and I see an individual that he lets in the front door. A man enters wearing a gray t-shirt.
Dexter lets in the man dressed in a gray t-shirt that he went to the door for.
This individual then walks with Dexter towards the victim's room.
Dexter then leaves this person he's let in, and he goes up to the 3rd floor.
While Dexter's upstairs, the individual in the gray shirt appears to enter the victim's room.
Dexter's on the 3rd floor, which is where his mom, Paulette Richardson, is. There's a camera on that floor as well, in the hallway.
Switch to the upstairs camera.
We see Dexter go up to his mother, and they have a brief conversation, but it's exciting.
He told his mother what had happened. Paulette then went around to other rooms, trying to notify the other residents.
Although there's no audio on the video, you could tell by the body language that something desperate has happened. It was tragic to them. You could tell they were affected by it. It was very helpful for us to corroborate their statements.
That matches with what he told us. Okay, switch back downstairs.
Investigators rewind to around 7:30 p.m., the time when Dexter lets the unknown man into the apartment building.
Can you punch in on him?
He's wearing a great short-sleeved t-shirt. It's got an emblem on the front of it. He's wearing jeans and some white sneakers with black shoelaces. And his demeanor is unusual. It's like he's going a little bit above and beyond to try and act like nothing has happened. By him trying not to be suspicious makes him look suspicious.
The video footage wasn't clear. It was dark.
We see the man walk off a camera toward Dion's apartment. He's off camera for a brief period of time.
Moments later, a second individual walks in.
He's going to Dion's room as well.
Both then leave the residence. We need to know who these two individuals are.
Anytime we locate video, we rewind back to see the victim earlier in the day. There may have been some things that took place that could help us to understand a motive or show a suspect casing the area, maybe doing their own reconnaissance of the victim before they decide to act. If they're on that video, then we have to eliminate them from being a suspect and just see what their absolute role is.
Detectives rewind the video to 8 a.m.
As we're watching the video from earlier in the day, you can see Dion. He comes walking out of his apartment. It looks like he's carrying some items like he's moving something from inside his residence out into the hallway.
What's going on?
And he also has a big, hefty trash bag that's full. He places that into the hallway, and then he kind of heads back toward the apartment.
Okay, I'm gonna call the landlord, see if he knows.
There was a lady that passed away on the 2nd floor, and Dion liked the unit. It was bigger. So he decided he wanted to move upstairs, so that was the plan for the day.
Dion was going through the natural progression of working and seeing the benefits of, being employed and having the responsibilities of having your own place. He was so proud of himself. Like, he was finally on his own and had his own space.
Okay, thank you. It was a planned move. Hit play.
I observed Dexter in the hallway. This is approximately 10 a.m. in the morning.
It looks like he's helping Dion moving items from inside his apartment out into the hallway. You can see him then go to the front door, and he's interacting with somebody at the front door.
Who's that there? Punch in?
But it looks like it's a man in dark clothing with some shorts on.
Okay, just keep it playing.
You don't see any kind of argument. There's nothing that's taken place that would draw our attention to a potential motive or a suspect. It just looks like they're all helping Dion move out.
Detectives review the rest of the footage to see who else interacts with Dion that day.
Dion is with a man. He's dressed in like a white tank top and dark-colored pants with some white tennis shoes with black laces. They're moving items out of the apartment into the hallway.
This video footage was grainy. It was very difficult to identify facial features, so you really need to pay attention to the way people are acting, to their body language.
This is somebody that Dion knows and he's comfortable with, but we're not certain what that gentleman's role is. We don't know really who he is yet, if he lives there, or if he's just somebody that came over to help. And then things changed.
At 10:48 a.m., the man in the white tank top starts acting strangely.
We're watching through it more. We see this same gentleman that was helping Dion move things out into the hallway. Now his demeanor has changed. He's like pacing back and forth. He's walking toward the door and looking out the window and just kind of like something's bothering him. He's got this bag strapped to his back, and you could tell there's some agitation in his body language.
What's going on with him?
He still has this black bag around his arm.
Okay, just keep it plain.
You can see he unzips the bag.
What's he holding?
That's a shotgun.
He's carrying a shotgun, what looks like a pistol grip shotgun with a shorter barrel, and he's standing in the hallway. It's not normal to be carrying a shotgun out in the open. In fact, it's illegal to do that. So immediately this guy becomes a person of interest to us.
One of the residents walk in, and he actually tries to hide the shotgun behind his leg as they pass and keep walking by. The residents are coming and going out of the front door and just walk past him. I found it odd that they're in their own home and they're passing this individual and they're not making any contact with him.
At 11:30 a.m., Dion moves his belongings upstairs before he leaves the building via its back door.
Later in the day, about 5:56, the video shows this gentleman with the white tank top again. He's wearing a hat now. He's looking out the window. It's like he's waiting for someone.
The man walks towards Dion's apartment at 6:02 p.m. Dion returns to the house 5 minutes later.
We see Dion at 6:07 p.m.
Minutes later, we see the individual in the white tank top running out of Dion's room, down the hallway.
He cautiously opens the front door, looks out before actually walking outside.
Punch it in.
We're looking at it, we're zooming in on it, we're blowing it up.
It's the gun.
He has a pistol grip shotgun in his hand, and he's stuffing it down his pants. That's absolutely a shotgun, no question.
I know at this point that Dion was just murdered. This individual has to be identified, and quickly. Now that I have this suspect captured on video, the next step is to identify the individuals that are in the hallway with him that can possibly identify him. While reviewing the footage of the residents in the hallway and seeing as they pass this individual with a white tank top and not pay any attention to him, one person stands out. He passes him and actually does a double take. Looks at him, walks by, looks back again, and then continues on.
Who's that?
He looks familiar to me.
Go back to the footage from the morning. That's the same person.
This is one of the individuals that was helping Dion move his items out of his room in the morning. I asked myself, why is this man doing a double take? Does he know him, or does he know something's about to happen?
We need to locate and interview him and figure out what his role is.
While investigators track down the witness in the surveillance footage, members of the local community gathered to pay tribute to Dion.
It was a visual. Like, in the immediate vicinity of where he was actually murdered, they drew, "Rest in peace, Dion A."
I think everyone who loses a young person in particular to violence unexpectedly, we have to do something, because murder and violence in Baltimore is just so normalized. You have to do something to show, the gravity of the loss. And the loss of a young person is such a huge loss. Their dreams are cut in half. I think people should be remembered, how you last saw them and the truest version of themselves. And again, for me and Dion, it's that big old smile.
And when bad things happen to good people, a lot of people don't say anything, but yeah, the city did. They went above and beyond for Dion.
Once we have our suspect in mind, we now go back to the scene and we talk to the witnesses again.
Good day, sir. Can I ask you a couple questions about Dion Smith?
In talking with the residents, I discovered that Dion was the building maintenance man, as well as volunteer for the Kids Zone at the Drug Rehabilitation Center. Everyone I spoke to spoke very highly of Dion. He was very friendly, very charismatic, liked everybody and helped everybody.
Do you recognize any of these people?
The individual in the black shirt who was helping Dion move was his cousin. He was identified as Little Zamani. While finding out more about Dion and his past, it was discovered that the building that he lived in was owned by his family. And his cousin also stayed in the building.
Me, Dion, and Louis Imani are related. Well, actually cousins. My uncle bought the house in 1983. When he passed away in 2009, the house went into disarray. But in 2016, we fixed it up. And I had asked Dion to manage the property for me. And you stay here for free. That might have made Little Imani feel a certain type of way, because I had put Dion in a position of more responsibility.
We talk to neighbors to see if there's any kind of activity that may have led up to the crime occurring, a motive, if you will.
Hello. Has there been any trouble in the building lately?
One of the witnesses provided information, said they heard the cousin and Dion arguing about who was in charge of the building. Now we need to find out, is this the motive of why Dion was killed?
Hey, did you ever find Imani?
So I go to look for Imani to be questioned, and Imani can't be found. The family doesn't know where he is, his friends doesn't know where he is, he's not answering his phone. Imani has disappeared. Now I have to think to myself, why is Imani missing? Is it because he set up the murder of Dion? Or is it because he's scared and doesn't want to cooperate with the police? Because in Baltimore, snitches get stitches. It's important to get Imani into the office and interview him, because he was in the hallway with the suspect. He is missing for 3 days, and I need to speak to him. I need to find out if he's involved in this or if he's a witness.
Right now, Little Imani is gone in the wind. We have no idea where he's at. He's just missing. Until something motivates Little Imani to come back around, he ain't come back around. If he's still around to come back around, you don't know if somebody there or if they not there, you know? That's how Baltimore is.
We have a unit inside a homicide called Homicide Operations, and they went searching for him. So they located Imani and brought him in for us to talk to him.
Little Imani tells detectives that he had a good relationship with Dion.
Just want to ask you a couple quick questions and we'll get you out of there, right?
No problem.
Okay. I'm going to show you a quick video.
Okay. Any idea who that is?
While being interviewed, Imani advised that he recognized the suspect, but he didn't know the suspect's real name. He was ruled out as being an accomplice, and is no longer involved in this investigation. It was great to have Amani come in, but it didn't solve this case. We needed more information.
We're really against the clock. Once the bad guy commits a crime like a homicide, they know that the police are now doing everything in their power to find out who this is.
In certain cases where you have video footage and you have a suspect captured on that footage and there's no one to identify that individual, we reach out into the public.
Hey, can you put out an appeal for information for me?
We have a unit in the police department known as our Public Information Office. And what we do is we create a segment of video that best shows the suspect. And we put that out to that unit, who then contacts all of our media outlets, Facebook, Instagram, all of those things, to see if anybody can identify who this is.
Let's watch those CCTV cameras for now while we wait.
I went back to the morning, the day that Dion was murdered, and I reviewed more footage.
Play from where the residents walked past the guy with the gun.
There's another individual that walks past the suspect and glances back at him. Now I want to know who this person is, and can they identify the suspect?
I'll ask the residents if anybody recognizes this guy.
Okay.
The man that passes the suspect is identified as Willie. We find out through residents that he also lives in the building.
At the same time, detectives compile a list of suspects following their appeal for information.
Hello?
Tips started coming in right away.
Can you spell it? Okay, great. Thanks.
When searching these names, we found that some of the names had criminal records with their photographs attached to the record.
Willie comes to the station to review a photo lineup of these potential suspects.
Another detective who's not involved in the investigation comes in and shows the witness this photographic array.
Greetings and salutations, my good man. How you doing, sir? All is well, all is well.
The way a photographic array works is that you take 6 photographs, one being who you believe to be the suspect, and then 5 other photographs of people that are similar looking. And you present them to the witness and you let them look at them one at a time.
Do you need to look at one again? Yeah, can I? I think it was this one, I think. I think it was. That one. Was that one? That one. Which one? This one? I don't know his name. Okay.
Willie positively identifies number 5 out of the 6 photographs. Willie is confident that this is the individual that was in the hallway. He tells us that he knows the person only by face and has seen him hanging out in the area but doesn't know his name. Number 5 is Terrell Gibson. Now we do a background investigation on Terrell Gibson.
He had a history of selling drugs. He also had possession of a deadly weapon.
Hello. Yeah, what can you tell me about Terrell Gibson?
Our investigation determined that Terrell had recently been released from prison and he needed a place to stay.
Okay, great. Okay.
He knew Dion, and he asked Dion if he could stay at his place. Dion, being the person he is, allowed Terrell to stay in his room.
If Dion had to share a sofa with Terrell, he would. You know, if he had to sleep on the floor and give Terrell the only pillow, like that's the person that Dion is. And Dion barely had enough for himself, but still, you know, allowed himself to help.
Dion helped him because he knew him. They grew up together. I guess Dion was sympathetic to his situation. I think Dion wanted to have somebody that kind of went through the same things he went through come out like how he came out. But I don't think Terrell had the type of support system that Dion had. And Dion wanted to support Terrell to see if it would help him become a better person.
Investigators scour the CCTV footage for clues to unlock Terrell's motive for killing Dion.
I spend hours reviewing this footage, going through every second, every minute. I identify an individual in the hallway, and this individual walks up to Dion's shoeboxes. There's several shoeboxes in the hallway. And this individual picks out one shoebox from this whole pile, walks away back to Dion's room.
Ross, come have a look at this.
About 10 minutes later, he comes back and places the shoebox on top of the rest of the shoeboxes that were in the hallway. Goes to the front door, and he opens the door and looks outside as if looking for someone. And then he comes back to the shoebox and puts it back in the exact order that he found it.
What's he doing?
It looks suspicious because at that time, I'm wondering what's in that shoebox, why is he hiding it, and why does he return it to the same exact spot when no one's around?
I think I seen him later in the day. Can you fast forward?
Yep.
The same individual that took the shoebox from Dion is now talking to Terrell in the hallway. The conversation is normal at first, but then it becomes more animated, and it's obvious these two are arguing. My first thoughts are, well, he stole something out of that shoebox, something valuable. It could be money or drugs. Is this possibly a motive?
We know Terrell had a pretty extensive history of drug dealing.
Is he hiding drugs there?
That may have been the cause of it, that, because the unknown man removed the shoebox from the hallway, that maybe that had something to do with the murder. While we're reviewing the footage, we're looking literally at every aspect. The behaviors of the way people are acting, the way they walk.
Go to the man in gray who Dexter lets in.
What we start to realize is that the gentleman in the gray t-shirt is the same shape and build as the gentleman in the tank top.
Punch in there.
He has these very distinct tennis shoes on. He's wearing Air Jordans, and they're white in color with black laces, and they have kind of an interesting shape on the heel of the shoe.
Go to Terrell earlier.
All the other features matched. The height, the weight, the way he walks, the way he kind of wears his pants, kind of pulled down. The gentleman with the gray t-shirt is the person with the white tank top on.
Terrell Gibson had changed his clothes after the murder, but he still had the same walk, the same look, the same distinct features, and he was still wearing the same jeans and same tennis shoes.
You're right.
Terrell Gibson came back to the house, I believe, to clean up any evidence that he left and to distance himself from being there when the murder was committed. At that point, I eliminated everybody else for being a suspect. Terrell was the one responsible for the murder of Dion. We got an arrest warrant for Terrell Gibson, but we didn't know where he was because he was on the run at that time. We need to locate him.
We know we're running against a clock. How do we know the suspect isn't going to come back and try to take out witnesses now or commit other crimes?
We now had an arrest warrant for Terrell Gibson, but we didn't know where he was.
We have a division called WATF, Warrant Apprehension Task Force. They have a squad of detectives. That's their entire mission, is to go and find this person. They go to known locations first, and they kind of work their way out from there. They go to relatives' houses. They do it through electronic surveillance. They'll contact people that are known to the suspect.
On the morning of July 6, 2017, the Warrant Apprehension Task Force found Terrell Gibson at his mother's house. They knocked on the door. They were actually let in by Terrell's mother. They then searched the house. He was hiding in the basement. They arrested him and brought him to the homicide office to be interrogated.
I'm Detective Moran. This is my partner. You were brought down here in reference to a friend of yours who was killed. What's his name? Dion got killed? Right. You were brought down here in reference to that, and just some things I want to talk to you about. Alright? About that whole incident. You don't want to talk? I don't want to talk, because if I don't got my lawyer present, I totally understand. I get it. I ain't trying to solve a criminal myself.
It's always disappointing when they don't want to talk to us. You know, it's, I think just from a human standpoint, I mean, to take another human life, there's nothing worse than that. It's almost like we're due an explanation.
If they don't want to speak to me, it doesn't bother me at all. I already have everything I need.
If anything, it makes them look more guilty.
After Terrell was arrested, we went back to his mother's house to conduct a search and seizure warrant to try to locate any evidence in reference to his case. We did not locate a gun, clothing, or any other evidence that could be helpful. Not having the murder weapon is actually common in most murders. The video footage in this case is really all the evidence we need. Seeing him run to that house and shoving that shotgun down the front of his pants, that's the evidence we need to convict Terrell Gibson.
Terrell Gibson is charged with the murder of Dion Smith. His trial begins on September 25th, 2018.
Terrell Gibson showed no remorse throughout the entire trial.
He didn't want to explain anything to us. He didn't want to tell us why it happened.
The jury found Terrell Gibson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison.
Nobody else seen in the CCTV footage from the apartment is charged with any wrongdoing.
It was a good feeling to get him off the street. Think about what he did. It's a heinous crime. He took a shotgun to somebody that he knew, a close friend of his, and killed him, senselessly killed him. And not just shot him, but shot him right in the head with a shotgun. I mean, that's violent. It's as violent as you could be. It's very close, it's very personal. Baltimore City is just a little bit safer because he's no longer there.
The state's attorney definitely relied on this video footage to seal a conviction.
Had we not found video in this case, this would have been a difficult case to solve. It was really an incredible piece of evidence.
Terrell's trial fails to establish a motive for Dion's murder. Dion's family are left to speculate why Terrell killed his friend.
What I think happened, my theory is, Dion, when he went to go moving the stuff from his first floor unit to the second floor unit, he found something that wasn't supposed to be there. I think Dion stashed it. I honestly think Dion was holding it in the other room. And Terrell was at the apartment, like, well, they're looking. They can't find it. It must have been important enough for him to murder somebody over, because that's what he did. He killed my cousin behind whatever he couldn't find. Dion wasn't trying to deal with that type of lifestyle. He wasn't trying to be around it. You might have did something negative in your past, but that don't mean that you're going to keep doing negative stuff in your future. And Dion didn't want nobody to look at him like that. So he had friends that dealt with that, but he was nowhere near a part of any of that type of stuff. Hopefully one day he'll tell us, because that's the only thing that could put me at ease about anything. We just would like to know what happened.
That monster gave no thought to the loss that Dion's children will forever experience.
I probably never will find anybody to replace him. He's a one of a kind, truly one of a kind.
In his 24 short years, you know, he had an impact on hundreds of young people. Well, Dion was here. He changed his life. As a result of changing his life, he was able to help other young people change their life.
It started with a smell, not a scream, not a gunshot, not a witness running into the night. Just a smell drifting out from a quiet house on a quiet street in East Texas. Late summer 1998, thick, metallic. Wrong. The kind of smell neighbors remember years later, but wish they had trusted sooner. By the time police forced the door open, the heat had already done its work. The air inside clung to their skin. Curtains drawn, television still humming. A coffee cup left half full on the table, a lipstick stain fading along the rim, life interrupted mid-sentence. And on the bedroom floor she was there. 32 years old, known in town, not famous, not wealthy, not controversial. Just familiar, the kind of person who waves when you pass by. The kind of person whose absence leaves a hole no one notices at first until it's too late. The first headline came fast. Texas woman found dead in home, foul play suspected. Then came the second. 1998 cold case begins after killer vanishes without trace. Because that's exactly what happened. No forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the final moments. No neighbors hearing anything unusual. No footprints, no weapon left behind, just a body and silence. The investigators worked a scene like men chasing a ghost. They bagged everything, fibers from the carpet. Skin cells under her nails, a strand of hair that didn't belong to her. Back then, DNA testing was still a slow, uncertain promise powerful, but not yet the sharp weapon it would become. They had evidence, they just didn't have a name. And so the questions began to spread through the town like wildfire. Who was in that house? Why her? And how does someone walk in, kill, and disappear without leaving a trace anyone can follow? The victim's routine was simple, predictable. She worked regular hours. Came home at the same time most nights, talked to the same circle of friends. No known enemies, no recent threats, nothing that screamed danger. But the deeper detectives looked, the more something felt off. Because normal lives don't end like this. They started with the obvious, the people closest to her, family, friends, co-workers, anyone who had seen her in the last 48 hours. Every alibi checked. Every timeline pulled apart. Her phone records, a limited analog, incomplete, painted a partial picture. A few calls, nothing unusual. No late-night panic, no sign she knew what was coming. Neighbors were questioned one by one. One said they saw a car that didn't belong. Another said they heard something, maybe a thud, but couldn't be sure. Another remembered nothing at all, which, in hindsight, felt just as unsettling. Because in cases like this, silence isn't empty. It's loaded. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The case file thickened, but the answers didn't. Detectives circled the same names again and again, hoping for cracks, hoping someone would slip, hoping guilt would show itself in a nervous glance, a contradiction, a story that didn't quite hold. Nothing. And then the label came. Cold case. It's a phrase that sounds clinical, detached, but in reality, it's heavy. It means the trail has gone dark. It means the killer is still out there, living, breathing, blending in. It means the victim's story has stopped, but the world hasn't. Years passed. The house was sold. The neighborhood changed. New families moved in, unaware of what had happened behind those walls. The story faded from headlines, then from memory, then from everyday conversation. But not from everyone. Because cold cases don't die. They wait. Inside evidence lockers, inside dusty files. Inside the minds of the detectives who couldn't let go. And inside one sealed envelope, the DNA. At the time, it was just a profile, numbers, markers, a biological fingerprint with no name attached. They ran it through databases, small, limited, incomplete databases, and got nothing. No match. No suspect. No direction. Just confirmation of what they already knew. Someone had been there. Someone had touched her. Someone had killed her. And then vanished. As the years stretched into a decade, the case became something else entirely. Not just a murder, but a question mark hanging over an entire community. A story told in fragments. A warning whispered between neighbors. Lock your doors. Don't trust too easily. Because whoever did this could still be here. Detectives changed. New faces took over old desks. Files were reopened, reviewed, reclassified. Technology improved, methods evolved, but the core problem remained the same. No name. Until something shifted. Not in Texas. Not in the police department, but in science. Because while the case sat frozen in time, the world didn't. DNA technology exploded forward. What was once slow became fast. What was once uncertain became precise. Databases grew exponentially. Millions of profiles, millions of connections. A digital web of identity spreading wider every year. And suddenly, cases like this weren't impossible anymore. They were waiting. The file came back onto the desk of a new investigator, younger, relentless, the kind who didn't see cold case as an ending, but as a challenge. He flipped through the pages, crime scene photos, interview transcripts, evidence logs, and then he stopped at the one thing that still mattered most. The DNA. Still there. Still clean. Still unidentified, but no longer useless. He requested a retest, not because the old work was wrong, but because the tools had changed. What came back wasn't just a confirmation. It was a breakthrough, a partial match. Not the killer, but someone connected, a relative. And just like that, the silence cracked. Not open, not completely, but enough. Because now the question wasn't who did this. It was who are they connected to. And in cases like this, that difference changes everything. The search narrowed, family trees built, names surfaced. Dozens at first, then fewer still. Each one a possibility. Each one a life that had intersected somehow with the victim. And buried somewhere in that web was the truth. But truth in cold cases doesn't arrive clean. It drags everything with it. Secrets, lies, things people thought were long buried. Because the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized this wasn't just a random act. It was personal. It had to be. And personal crimes leave deeper scars. The kind that don't fade. The kind that hide in plain sight. The kind that sit at dinner tables, attend family gatherings, smile in photographs, and never once reveal what they've done. Until something forces them to. And now something had. The DNA didn't just reopen a case. It opened a door. And behind that door was a secret no one in that quiet Texas town was ready to face. Not yet. Because the name hadn't been spoken. But it was coming. Slowly. Inevitably. And when it did, it wouldn't just solve a murder. It would shatter everything people thought they knew about the past. And about each other. The name didn't come all at once. It never does. Instead, it crept in quietly, hidden between branches of a family tree that looked ordinary on the surface. Birthdays, marriages, relocations. The predictable rhythm of American life, but underneath, something didn't line up. Not perfectly, not cleanly. There were gaps. Distances that didn't make sense. People who should have crossed paths but officially never did. Investigators leaned in. Because this is where cold cases start to breathe again, not in dramatic confessions or sudden arrests, but in spreadsheets, ancestry charts, and long nights spent connecting lives that were never meant to connect. The partial DNA match pointed to a relative. Not close enough to accuse, but close enough to narrow the field, a cousin, a nephew, an uncle. Someone tied by blood to the unknown man who had stood inside that house in 1998 and left a body behind. They began mapping. Names turned into faces, faces into histories. Histories into timelines. Every male within the genetic radius became a possibility. Every movement, every job, every address was pulled into focus. And slowly the circle tightened. One name started appearing more often than the others. Not because it stood out, but because it didn't. He had lived a quiet life, no violent record, no dramatic incidents. No reason, on paper, to ever be connected to a homicide investigation. The kind of man who blends in so well, you forget he's there. Which, in cases like this, is exactly what makes him dangerous. He had been in Texas in 1998. That alone wasn't enough. Thousands of men had been in Texas in 1998. But he had also been within driving distance of the victim's home. Not officially tied to her, no known friendship. No documented interaction, but proximity is a powerful thing, especially when combined with opportunity. Investigators pulled deeper. Employment records, he had worked odd jobs back then. Nothing stable, construction, maintenance, short-term contracts that placed him in neighborhoods, inside homes, around people who wouldn't necessarily remember him years later. Invisible access. That's what it looked like. The kind of access that doesn't raise alarms until it's too late. They looked at his personal life. Married now, children, a house, a routine. The image of normalcy rebuilt over decades, layer by layer, until whatever had happened in 1998 was buried beneath it. Or so it seemed, because buried doesn't mean gone, and DNA doesn't forget. The investigators didn't rush. Cold cases punish impatience. They demand precision. Every move had to be careful, quiet. They couldn't tip him off. Not yet. Not until they had something stronger than suspicion. So they watched. Discreetly. Patterns emerged, daily habits, places he visited. The way he carried himself, calm, measured, unremarkable. No signs of fear, no signs of guilt. But then again, after 20 years would there be? Or had he learned how to live with it? That question lingered. Because the longer someone carries a secret, the better they become at hiding it, not just from others, but from themselves. Investigators needed confirmation, not theory, not probability, proof. And for that they needed his DNA. But getting it isn't as simple as knocking on a door and asking politely. Not without enough cause, not without risking everything they had built so far. So they waited for a mistake. Everyone makes one. Eventually, days turned into weeks again. Surveillance logs filled with small, ordinary details. Coffee stops, grocery runs. Conversations overheard but meaningless. A life that looked clean. Too clean. Until the moment came. It was nothing dramatic. No chase, no confrontation. Just a discarded object. Something he touched and left behind. A cup, a wrapper, something small, forgettable. The kind of thing people throw away without thinking twice. But in that moment it became everything. Investigators moved fast, collected it, sealed it, sent it to the lab. And then they waited. Because this was the moment. The line between suspicion and truth. The lab worked with quiet urgency. Swabs taken, profiles extracted. Compared against the original DNA from the crime scene, the same DNA that had sat in evidence for decades, waiting for this exact moment. Hours passed, then longer. And when the result came back, it didn't whisper. It hit. Match. Not partial. Not possible. Definitive. The man they had been watching, the man who had lived a quiet, ordinary life for years, had been inside that house in 1998. He had been there. The room went still. Because confirmation doesn't just answer questions. It creates new ones. Why him? How did he know her? And most importantly, what had really happened inside that house? The past, once buried, began to rise. Investigators reopened every detail, now with a name attached. They went back to the beginning, to the victim, her life, her connections, searching for any thread that could tie her to him. And this time they found something. Small, almost insignificant, but real. A connection that had been overlooked, dismissed, or simply missed in the chaos of the original investigation. He had worked near her home. Not inside it. Not officially. but close enough to see her, to learn her routine, to understand when she was alone, to watch without being noticed. The kind of slow, silent observation that doesn't leave evidence, except eventually it does. Because crimes like this don't come out of nowhere. They build, piece by piece, moment by moment, until something breaks. And when investigators looked closer at his timeline, something else surfaced. A gap, unexplained, on the night of the murder. Back then, it had meant nothing, just another man with an unverified alibi in a sea of unverified alibis. But now it meant everything, because the gap wasn't just time, it was opportunity. And opportunity, combined with presence, combined with DNA, forms something undeniable. The case was no longer cold. It was alive and moving fast. But the deeper they dug, the darker it became. Because the connection between him and the victim wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It wasn't a stranger passing through. It was something closer. Something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. A familiarity that raised more questions than answers. Had they spoken before? Had she let him in willingly? Or had he forced his way into her life in a way no one ever saw coming? Investigators prepared for the next step. The confrontation. The moment where past meets present. Where silence meets accusation. Where a man who thought he had outrun time is finally forced to face it. But even then, nothing about this case felt simple. Because behind the DNA, behind the timelines, behind the quiet life he had built, there was still something missing. A motive. A reason. And in cases like this, the reason is often the most disturbing part. Because it reveals not just what happened, but why. And as the pieces came together, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a murder hidden by time. It was a secret protected by it. A secret that had survived decades. A secret that had lived inside a family unnoticed. Or maybe not entirely unnoticed. Because sometimes the truth isn't completely hidden. Sometimes it's felt in silences, in things left unsaid, in the way people avoid certain memories, certain names, certain nights. And now, with the DNA match confirmed, investigators weren't just looking at one man. They were looking at everyone around him. Because secrets like this rarely belong to just one person. And somewhere in that circle, someone knew something. They always do. The question was, who would break first? They didn't knock on his door right away. That's the thing about cases like this. Once you have the name, the instinct is to move, to act, to end it. But experience teaches restraint, because the moment you step in, everything changes. People close ranks, stories shift, memories harden into rehearsed versions of the truth. So instead, they widened the lens. If the secret had lived this long, it hadn't survived alone. They started with the people closest to him. His wife. 2 decades of marriage. Shared routines, shared space, shared silence. Investigators pulled her background first, not because she was a suspect, but because proximity changes everything. When someone carries a secret for that long, it leaves traces. Not always visible, but there, in behavior, in patterns. In the things that don't quite make sense until you know where to look. She had no record, no history of violence, no obvious red flags. Friends described her as steady, reserved, loyal. The kind of person who builds a life and protects it. But loyalty has layers, and sometimes it protects more than it should. Then the children. Teenagers now, old enough to have formed memories, habits, impressions. Old enough to notice when something in the house feels off, even if they don't understand why. Investigators were careful here. Quiet, distant. This wasn't about them, not yet, but in cases like this, the ripple effect matters. Because whatever happened in 1998 didn't stay in 1998. It followed him home. Then came extended family. Brothers, cousins, uncles, the same branches that had led investigators here in the first place. They revisited interviews, past statements, old addresses, and slowly something began to surface. Not a confession, not even a direct accusation, just fragments. A cousin who remembered a sudden move, a brother who recalled a period where he wasn't himself, an old friend who described him as quiet but intense. Nothing concrete, but together they formed a pattern. And patterns don't lie. They point toward moments, toward changes, toward the exact places where something broke. Investigators built a timeline, not just of the night of the murder, but of his life around it. Weeks before, months after, they were looking for disruption, for anything that suggested pressure building or release. And they found it. In the weeks leading up to the murder, his work had become unstable. Jobs ending abruptly, conflicts with supervisors, a trail of short-term contracts that didn't last, financial strain creeping in, subtle but real, pressure. Then the night itself, that gap, still there, still unexplained, but now surrounded by context. And after, that's where it got interesting, because within months of the murder, he left the area. Not dramatically, not overnight, just moved on. New job, new town, a quiet transition that, at the time, meant nothing. But now, it looked different. It looked like distance, like escape, like someone putting space between themselves and something they never wanted to face again. Investigators circled back to the victim, because understanding her meant understanding him. She had lived alone, independent, careful, no history of letting strangers into her home. No record of reckless behavior. Everything about her routine suggested awareness, control, which raised a question that wouldn't go away. If he had been inside that house, how did he get in? No forced entry, no signs of struggle at the door, which meant one of two things. She knew him, or she trusted him, even if just for a moment. Investigators revisited the overlooked connection, the one that had seemed too small to matter years ago. His work near her home, the possibility of brief encounters, passing conversations, the kind of low-level familiarity that builds without anyone realizing it. A wave, a greeting, a good morning exchanged in passing, enough to lower defenses, enough to open a door. And once that door opens, everything changes. They reconstructed the scene again, now with him in it. He arrives. She recognizes him not as a stranger, but not as someone close either, just familiar enough. The door opens. He steps inside. At first, nothing is wrong. Conversation, maybe small talk, the ordinary rhythm of two people sharing space. And then something shifts. Something goes off script. A word, a look, a moment where intention surfaces. And from that moment on, it's no longer a visit. It's a crime. The details of what happened next remained locked in evidence and silence. The exact sequence, the precise trigger, those things often stay buried unless someone speaks. And he hadn't spoken. Not in 20 years. But the aftermath told its own story. The lack of forced entry. The limited signs of struggle. The controlled scene. This wasn't chaotic. It was contained, which meant he didn't panic. Not immediately. He acted. He finished what he started. And then he left, closing the door behind him as if nothing had happened. As if the house could return to normal on its own. As if silence would erase everything. And for a long time, it almost did. Back in the present, investigators prepared to break that silence. They had the DNA. They had the timeline. They had the connection. Now they needed the confrontation. But confrontations in cases like this aren't just about evidence. They're about pressure. About watching someone face the collapse of the life they've built. Because when the past comes back after decades, it doesn't knock politely. It crashes in. They brought him in under controlled conditions. No spectacle. No public scene. Just a request for questioning tied to new developments. He agreed. Calm. Cooperative. The same man they had been watching for weeks. He sat across from them in a room designed to strip away comfort. Neutral walls, bright lights, no distractions. Just a table, a chair, and the weight of everything he had carried for years. They started simple. Background questions. Work history. Where he lived in 1998. Who he knew. Routine things. The kind of questions that build a baseline. His answers were steady, measured, practiced. Because whether he realized it or not, he had been preparing for this moment for years. Every omission, every half-truth, every carefully chosen word. It all added up. Then they shifted, closer to the victim. Had he ever been in her neighborhood? Did he recognize her name? Had he ever spoken to her? He hesitated, just slightly. But in interrogation rooms, slight is everything. Because it's not the pause itself, it's what causes it. He said no. No connection. No memory. Nothing. And that's when they placed it on the table. Not physically. Not yet. But verbally. The DNA. The match. The undeniable link between him and that house and that night. For the first time, the mask cracked. Not shattered. Not completely. But enough. A shift in posture. A change in breathing. Eyes that no longer held steady. Because denial works until it doesn't. And in that moment, it didn't. The room changed. The air thickened. Because now, it wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. And somewhere behind his silence, behind the years, behind the life he had built, the truth was still there, waiting. And for the first time in over 2 decades, it was no longer hidden. It was cornered. Cornered doesn't mean broken. Not yet. He leaned back slightly, just enough to create distance between himself and the words hanging in the air. The DNA, the house, the year 1998, each one placed carefully, like pieces on a board he could no longer control. For a long moment, he said nothing. Silence filled the room, not empty, not passive, but dense, pressing in from all sides. Investigators didn't rush to fill it. They let it sit. Because silence in an interrogation room is not absence. It's pressure. And pressure forces movement. He exhaled slowly, eyes drifting down to the table, then back up again, composure trying to reassemble itself. Years of normal life pushing against the reality now unfolding in front of him. That's not possible, he said. The words came out steady, controlled, but something underneath them wasn't. Because denial is strongest at the beginning. It's reflex, instinct, the mind's first defense against collapse. Investigators didn't challenge him immediately. They didn't raise their voices or lean in aggressively. They simply held the line. We tested it twice. One of them said, calm, precise, same result. Another pause, longer this time. Because repetition makes things real. Twice. Same result. No room for error. His jaw tightened, a subtle movement, almost invisible. But in this room, nothing goes unnoticed. Then your test is wrong. It was expected. They had seen it before, the shift from disbelief to deflection. If the evidence can't be denied, question the method. Question the system. Question anything that creates doubt. But this wasn't 1998 anymore. The science had caught up, and it wasn't letting go. They let him sit with it. Then they moved again, not forward, but sideways, back to the timeline. Where were you that night? A simple question, one he had likely answered in his own mind many times over the years. Maybe even rehearsed without realizing it. A version of events that felt safe, that held together. He gave them an answer, general and clear. At home, he said, or nearby. He couldn't remember exactly. It had been a long time. Too long to recall details. Convenient, but not unusual. Time erodes memory, that's true. But it also exposes inconsistencies. Investigators already knew about the gap. They knew his alibi had never been confirmed. That it had floated unanchored even back then. And now, with everything else in place, that gap wasn't just a missing detail. It was a void. And voids attract attention. They pressed gently. Anyone who can confirm that? He shook his head. No, of course not. Another silence. Another shift in the air. Because now the pieces weren't just on the table. They were starting to connect. You were working in that area, the investigator continued, voice even, near her home. A flicker. Quick. Gone almost instantly. But it was there. Recognition. Not of the accusation, but of the memory. And memories are harder to control. He nodded just slightly. Yeah, I worked a lot of places back then. True, but incomplete. Because truth, when used carefully, can hide more than lies. They leaned in, not physically, but strategically. You ever talk to her? No. Too fast. The first answer that came without pause. And that's what made it stand out. Because real memory hesitates. It searches. Instant denial is something else. They let it pass. For now. Instead, they shifted again. To the object. The discarded item. The one that gave them his DNA. They didn't describe it. They didn't need to. We collected your DNA recently, they said. You didn't know that. His eyes narrowed slightly. A different reaction this time. Less defensive. More calculating. Because this wasn't about the past anymore. This was about the present. About how close they had gotten without him noticing. How, he asked. Not why. Not what for. How? Because control matters. And realizing you've lost it changes everything. Doesn't matter, came the reply. What matters is it matches. The word hung there. Matches. Simple. Final. He looked down again. Longer this time. And something shifted. Not outwardly. Not in a way that would be obvious to anyone outside that room. But internally. Because this was the moment where denial meets reality. And reality doesn't blink. You said you didn't know her, the investigator continued. You said you'd never been in that house. No response. But your DNA says otherwise. Silence. And then, a crack. Small. Barely there. I don't remember, he said. Not denial. Not exactly. But not truth either. It was the first step away from certainty. The first sign that the structure he had built was starting to give. Investigators recognized it immediately. This was the pivot point. The place where pressure, applied correctly, begins to shift a person from resistance to uncertainty. And uncertainty opens doors. You don't remember being in her house? Careful. Precise. No accusation. Just a question. He hesitated. Longer than before. I worked around there. People ask for help sometimes. There it was. The adjustment. Subtle, but critical. From never to maybe. From no connection to possible contact. A door opening just a few inches. And once it opens, it doesn't close easily. Investigators moved in. Not aggressively, but deliberately. What kind of help? Fixing things, maintenance, whatever people needed. Did she ask for help? I don't know. Again, too quick, too sharp. The line between uncertainty and defense blurring. Because now the story was changing. And changing stories create friction. They let the tension build. Because friction creates heat. And heat forces movement. You were in her house, the investigator said quietly. That's not a question anymore. No response. Your DNA was there, at the scene, not outside. Not in the yard, inside. Each word placed carefully, measured, unavoidable. He shifted in his chair. The first physical sign of discomfort? Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. Because the walls were closing in. Not suddenly, but steadily, relentlessly. And he could feel it. What happened that night? The investigator asked. No accusation, no raised voice, just a question. The question, the one that had been waiting for over 20 years. He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he stared at the table again, at the empty surface where nothing was written but everything was implied. Time stretched. Seconds, minutes, hard to tell. Because in moments like this, time doesn't move normally. It drags, it presses, it waits, and then. I didn't mean for anything to happen. The words came out low, almost swallowed, but they were there. And once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. The room didn't react, not outwardly, but everything changed. Because that wasn't denial. That wasn't deflection. That was proximity to truth. What do you mean? The investigator asked, voice steady. Another pause. Another internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. I was just there. She let me in. We talked. That's it. Not enough. Not even close. But it was movement. And movement matters. Then how does your DNA end up at a murder scene? No answer. Because now the gap between his words and the evidence was too large to bridge with anything but truth. And truth is what he had spent 20 years avoiding. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Not defensive, not controlled. It was heavy, cracking, because the past wasn't just knocking anymore. It was inside the room, sitting across from him, waiting. And for the first time, he was running out of ways to keep it out. He stayed quiet, but the silence had changed. Before, it had been controlled, something he used, something he hid behind. Now it felt different, thicker, and stable, like it might collapse under its own weight at any moment. Investigators didn't interrupt it. They let it stretch. Because once someone crosses that line from denial into partial admission, the hardest part isn't getting them to talk. It's letting them hear themselves. He shifted again in his chair, slower this time, like every movement had to be considered. His hands came together on the table, fingers interlocked, then separated again. A small detail. Repeated twice. Nervous energy. Not panic. Not yet. But close. You said she let you in, the investigator repeated, voice calm, almost conversational. So you knew her. A pause. Not as long as before. I'd seen her around. There it was. Another step. Not strangers. Not anymore. Familiar. Enough to recognize. Enough to open a door. What did you talk about? I don't remember. But this time, it didn't land the same way. Because memory doesn't disappear in pieces like that. Not the kind tied to a night like this. Not when it ends with a body on the floor and a life erased. Investigators didn't challenge him directly. Instead, they reframed. You don't remember or you don't want to say. The distinction mattered. And he knew it. His jaw tightened again. A pattern now. A physical response he couldn't fully control. I just don't remember everything. Better. More believable. But still incomplete. They let it sit. Then pushed slightly. You went inside, you talked. Then what? Silence. But shorter. We argued. The word came out quickly. Like it had been waiting. Like it had slipped past whatever barrier he had tried to build. And once it was out, it shifted everything. Because arguments don't happen in isolation. They come from something. A trigger. A tension. A moment where control starts to break. What about, the investigator asked. I don't know, it was stupid. Just something small. But something small doesn't end in murder. And everyone in that room knew it. They didn't say it out loud. They didn't need to. Instead, they leaned into the gap. What kind of small thing turns into that? No answer. Because now the weight of the word that filled the space, not defined, but understood. He exhaled again, heavier this time. And for a moment, his eyes closed. Not long. Just enough to signal something internal shifting. I didn't plan anything, he said. And there it was. The first real piece. Not just presence. Not just contact. But intent, or the absence of it. A claim. A line he was trying to draw. This wasn't premeditated. This wasn't calculated. This was something else. Something that got out of control. Investigators let him build that version. Because sometimes letting someone explain reveals more than forcing them to confess. You didn't plan it, the investigator echoed. So what happened? Another pause. But now it felt different. Less like resistance. More like selection. Choosing which version of the truth to give. Which parts to release. Which parts to hold back. She said something, he muttered. What did she say? I don't remember exactly. Again, memory fading exactly where it matters most. Convenient, but fragile. Because the rest of his story was starting to take shape. You went into her house, you talked, you argued. She said something that upset you. No denial, just silence. And then, his fingers tightened again. Knuckles pale now. I just lost it. The words dropped flat. No drama, no emotion, just a statement. But behind it was everything. Because losing it isn't an explanation. It's an escape. A way to describe something without owning it. Investigators didn't let it stand alone. What does that mean? Silence again, but shorter. I got angry. How angry? No answer. How angry does someone have to be? The investigator paused, then finished the sentence slowly. To kill someone. That word again. Kill. Direct. Unavoidable. And this time it landed. Hard. He looked up, eyes meeting theirs for the first time in several minutes. And there was something there now that hadn't been before. Not just tension. Not just calculation. Something closer to exposure. Like the distance he had kept for years was gone. I didn't mean to kill her. The second time he said it. But now it sounded different. Less like a defense. More like a confession wrapped in denial. Investigators moved carefully. Because this was the edge. Push too hard and he shuts down. Not enough and the truth stays buried. What did you mean to do? A simple question. But it cut deep. Because it forced intention into the open. Another long pause. Longer than any before. His breathing shifted. Slightly faster. Controlled but slipping. I grabbed her. The room stayed still. No interruption. No reaction. Just space. For him to continue. She was yelling. I didn't want anyone to hear. There it was. Not fear of her. Fear of being heard. Of being seen. Of consequences. The moment where everything shifts from interaction to control. What happened next? His eyes dropped again. Voice lower now. I held on too tight. No details. No description. But enough. More than enough. Because now the outline was clear. The argument. The escalation. The attempt to silence. And the result. Unintended or not. Final. And then the investigator asked, I left. Just like that. As if the ending was as simple as walking out the door. As if what happened inside didn't follow him. Didn't stay with him. Didn't define the next 20 years of his life. But it had. Whether he admitted it or not. You didn't call anyone. No. You didn't try to help her. A shake of the head. Small. Almost invisible. You just left. Silence. Because there was no way to soften that. No way to explain it. No way to make it anything other than what it was. A choice. And that choice is what turns a moment into a crime. The room fell quiet again. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was settled. Because the truth was no longer hidden. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to see what happened. Enough to understand the shape of it. But something still didn't fit. Something still lingered beneath the surface. Because even now, even with the admissions, there were gaps. Pieces missing. Details that didn't align perfectly with the evidence. And investigators knew it. Because in cases like this, the first version of the truth is rarely the whole truth. And whatever he was still holding back was waiting just beneath the surface, ready to change everything again. It should have felt like the end. A man in a room, a voice finally breaking. The outline of a confession taking shape after more than 2 decades of silence. For most cases, this is where things lock into place: motive, action, consequence. But this case didn't settle. It shifted. Because the version he was giving them didn't fully match what they already knew. Investigators didn't confront him with that immediately. They let the silence return, softer now, less aggressive, but still present. The kind of silence that invites more words or forces them out. He sat there, shoulders slightly lower than before, as if something had been lifted or maybe just moved. His breathing had slowed again, not calm, not steady, just different. People change once they start talking. They reveal themselves in layers. And he wasn't done. You said you grabbed her, the investigator continued, voice even, controlled. You said you held on too tight. A small nod. Eyes still down. She was yelling. Another nod. You didn't want anyone to hear. Silence, but no denial. And then you left. Yeah. The structure of his story was there now. Simple, contained, almost too clean. And that was the problem. Because the crime scene had told a slightly different story. Not completely different, but enough. Enough to raise questions. Enough to create tension between what he said and what had actually happened in that house. Investigators moved carefully. You said it wasn't planned. It wasn't. Quick. Immediate. Still holding that line. And you didn't bring anything with you. No weapon? No. Again, fast. Too fast. Because the evidence suggested otherwise. Not clearly. Not definitively. But there were indicators, things at the scene that didn't quite align with a purely spontaneous act. Objects disturbed in a way that suggested more than just a struggle. Details that had never been fully explained. Until now. Or at least that was the hope. You were working in that area, the investigator said, going in and out of homes. Yeah. You ever carry tools with you? A pause. Not long, but noticeable. Sometimes, there it was. The shift. Subtle, but important. Because tools change things, they introduce possibility, control, intent. What kind of tools? Basic stuff, whatever the job needed. Did you have tools with you that day? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't remember. And there it was again. Memory fading exactly where it mattered most. Investigators didn't push immediately. They let the weight of the question linger. Because even without an answer, it had already done its work. It had introduced doubt into his version, into the simplicity he was trying to maintain. Because I lost control is one thing, but bringing something with you, that's different. That suggests preparation, or at least readiness. They shifted direction again, back to the moment. You said she was yelling, the investigator continued. What was she yelling about? I told you I don't remember exactly, but you remember grabbing her. No answer. You remember holding on. Silence. You remember leaving. His jaw tightened again. Because now the pattern was clear. Selective memory. The mind protecting certain details while allowing others through. And those protected details are usually the most important ones. Was she scared? The investigator asked. A different angle. Not about him. About her. A pause. Longer than expected. Yeah. Soft. Barely audible. But real. Why? No answer. Because of you. Silence again. But heavier now. Because this wasn't about actions anymore. It was about impact. About what he had done from her perspective. And that's harder to face. She knew something was wrong, didn't she? No response. She realized you weren't just there to talk. A shift in his posture. Small, but there. And that was enough. Because that's where the story changes. From argument to threat. From tension to fear. What happened before you grabbed her? The investigator asked. Another pause. But this time it felt different. Less defensive. More conflicted. Like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't want to step into. She told me to leave. The words came out slow. Measured. But they landed hard. Because that's the moment. The line. The clear, unmistakable boundary. She wanted him out. And he stayed. Did you leave? No answer. You didn't, did you? Silence. But the answer was already there. Implied. Obvious. Because everything that followed only happens if he stays. If he ignores that line. If he chooses not to walk away. She told you to leave, the investigator repeated, and you didn't. A long pause. Then, no. The word came out flat, but final. And just like that, the story shifted again. Because now it wasn't just about losing control. It was about a choice. A moment where he could have ended everything before it began. And didn't. What happened after she told you to leave? His hands came together again. Fingers tightening. Releasing. Tightening again. A loop. I didn't want to go. Why? No answer. Why didn't you leave? I don't know. But that wasn't true. Not completely. Because people always have a reason, even if they don't want to admit it. Especially then. You went into her house. The investigator said she asked you to leave. You refused. She got scared. She started yelling. No interruption. No denial. And then you grabbed her. Silence. But this time it wasn't resistance. It was acceptance. Because the sequence was clear. And he knew it. The room felt smaller now. Tighter? Because every step forward removed another layer of distance between him and what he had done. And after you grabbed her, you held on. Yeah. And you didn't stop. No response. You didn't stop even when she stopped yelling. That one landed differently. Because it forced him to confront the moment where everything changed. Not just struggle. Not just fear. But silence. The kind of silence that only comes at the end. His breathing shifted again. Faster now. Less controlled. I told you I didn't mean. I know what you said, the investigator cut in, still calm. But that's not what I'm asking. A pause. Sharp. Focused. I'm asking when did you realize she wasn't fighting anymore? Silence. Long. Heavy. Because that's the moment people avoid. The exact second where everything becomes irreversible. Where intention no longer matters. Where outcome takes over. I don't know, he said finally. But his voice had changed. Cracked. Not in volume, but in tone. Because somewhere in that answer was the truth. He did know. He just couldn't say it. Not yet. And after that you left her there. No answer. You didn't check. Silence. You didn't call anyone. Nothing. You just walked out. A long pause. Then, Yeah, barely a whisper, but enough. The room went still again, but now it wasn't waiting. It was settling, because the shape of the crime was no longer a mystery. But the truth still wasn't complete, because something about his story still didn't fit perfectly, and investigators could feel it, not in what he said, but in what he didn't. The missing pieces, the parts of the night that remained just out of reach. Because even now, even with everything he had admitted, there was still something he was holding back, something that changed the story, something that made it more than just a moment of anger gone too far. And whatever that was, it hadn't surfaced yet, but it would. Because secrets like this don't stay buried forever. Not when the truth is this close. Not when there's nowhere left to hide. There's a point in every interrogation where the story stops growing and starts resisting. He had given them something enough to move forward. Enough to draw a line from that house in 1998 to the man sitting in front of them now. But it wasn't complete. It wasn't clean. And more importantly, it wasn't honest all the way through. Investigators could feel it. Not in the big moments. Those had already cracked open. It was in the smaller spaces, the pauses that lasted a fraction too long, the details that dissolved into I don't remember just before they became dangerous. The way his version kept circling the same safe ground, never stepping too far into what really happened. Because even now he was still protecting something, and whatever it was mattered. They didn't push harder right away. Instead, they stepped back. Not physically, strategically, letting the conversation breathe, shift, change rhythm. Because when pressure stops increasing, people often fill the space themselves. And he did. I didn't go there to hurt her, he said suddenly, almost as if the thought had forced its way out. I wasn't planning anything. The line again, reinforced. He needed that to be true, or at least to sound true. Then why did you go there? The investigator asked. A simple question, but it cut straight through everything else. He hesitated, longer this time, because this wasn't about the act anymore. It was about the beginning. The reason. I told you I worked around there. That's not what I asked. Silence. You chose her house. A shift in his posture. Subtle, but immediate. Because now the focus had narrowed. Not just being in the area. Being there. At that door. At that moment. I was just going door to door. Looking for work. Possible. Plausible. But incomplete. Because if that were true, there would be a pattern. Other houses, other conversations, other people who remembered him knocking, asking, offering. Investigators already knew there weren't. They let him continue. She answered, we talked, that's it. That's not it, the investigator replied quietly. And the room tightened again. Because contradiction introduces instability. You didn't just talk, you stayed. No response. She told you to leave. Silence. You didn't. His jaw flexed again. A familiar sign now. The internal pressure rising. You said you didn't plan anything, the investigator continued. But you didn't leave when she asked. You stayed when you shouldn't have. Still nothing. And then things changed. The word hung there. Changed. Neutral. But loaded. Because change implies a shift. A moment where something crosses a line. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. What made it change? The investigator asked. A pause. But this time it wasn't just hesitation. It was resistance. Because whatever happened in that moment was closer to the truth than anything he had said so far. She got upset. He said finally. Why? I don't know. But again, that wasn't true. Not completely. Because people don't get upset without a trigger. Something caused it. Something he did. Or said. What did you say to her? The investigator pressed. Silence. Long. Heavy. because this was the edge. The place where his version started to break down. I don't remember. There it was again. The shield. But now it felt thinner, more fragile, because too many things had already slipped through. You remember enough. The investigator said, voice still calm, but firmer now. You remember going there? You remember talking. You remember arguing. You remember grabbing her. No response. So what did you say that made her tell you to leave? Another pause. But this one was different, because his breathing changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A slight increase, a shift in rhythm. And then I asked her something. The words came out slow, careful, like each one had to be chosen. What did you ask? He looked down again, at the table, at nothing, at everything. I just asked if she needed help. That's not what made her upset. Silence. Because they both knew it. That's not what made her tell you to leave, the investigator repeated. The pressure returned. Not overwhelming, but precise, targeted, focused on the one place he didn't want to go. Another long pause. And then, I asked if I could come back later. Not enough. Still safe. Still controlled. People don't tell someone to leave just for that. No answer. Something else happened. Silence. You said something else. His hands tightened again, fingers pressing into each other. A physical anchor, trying to hold something in place. What did you say? The investigator asked, quieter now. Not aggressive, but closer. And that's when it shifted. Not dramatically, not with a sudden confession, just a small fracture. I said she looked nice. The words were almost lost in the air, but they landed because now the tone of the interaction changed. Not work, not neutral, personal, and unwanted. She didn't like that, the investigator said. A small shake of the head. No. Did she tell you to stop? Silence. Did she tell you to leave? A nod. Barely visible, but there. And you didn't. Another nod, slower, heavier, because now the moment was clearer. Not just an argument, a boundary crossed, a signal ignored. You made her uncomfortable, the investigator continued. She told you to leave, you stayed anyway. No response. And then she got scared. His breathing shifted again, faster, less controlled. Because now the story wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about escalation, about pushing past a line that should never have been crossed. What did you do when she got scared? The investigator asked. A long pause. I told her to calm down. How? I don't know, I just said it. But she didn't calm down. No answer. She got louder. Silence. She told you to leave again. Nothing. And that's when you grabbed her. His hands stopped moving, frozen, as if the body itself had reached a point it couldn't move past. Yeah, the word came out low, flat, but final. And now the picture was different. Not just a random argument, not just a moment of anger, but something more deliberate, more controlled, more intentional. Even if only in fragments, because he had stayed, he had pushed, he had ignored, and when she resisted, he had acted. The room felt heavier now, because the truth, piece by piece, was becoming harder to reshape, harder to soften, harder to deny. But still, something was missing, because even now, even with this version, there were gaps. Moments that didn't align perfectly with what had been found at the scene. Details that suggested more than just a brief struggle. And investigators could feel it, like something just beneath the surface, waiting. You said you grabbed her, the investigator said again, but the scene suggests more than that. No response. There was more movement, more disruption. Silence. Things don't look like that from just a few seconds. His jaw tightened again, harder this time, because now the story was under pressure, and pressure reveals fault lines. What else happened in that house? The investigator asked. No answer. What are you not telling us? Silence. But this time it wasn't just resistance. It was strain. Visible. Building. Because whatever he was still holding back was closer to the truth than anything he had said so far. And it was only a matter of time before it broke through. Strain doesn't stay hidden forever. It builds quietly, gradually, until something gives. And in that room, under the steady weight of questions and silence and time, he was starting to give. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but in pieces. Small fractures spreading through the version of the story he had been trying to hold together. Investigators didn't rush it. They didn't need to, because once the cracks appear, pressure does the rest. You said you grabbed her, the investigator repeated, slower now, each word deliberate. But the scene tells us it didn't stop there. No answer. But this time, the silence wasn't solid. It wavered. You moved through the house, the investigator continued. There was more than one point of contact. A shift in his shoulders. Subtle. But there. You didn't just stay in one place. His hands tightened again. Then loosened. Then tightened again. A rhythm. Breaking down. What happened after you grabbed her? The investigator asked. The question hung there. Simple. Direct. Unavoidable. He swallowed. A small motion, but loud in the stillness. I told you I just held on. Not enough. Not anymore. Then why does the evidence say otherwise? Silence. Because now it wasn't just his memory against their questions. It was his version against reality. There were signs of movement, the investigator pressed. From the living area toward the bedroom, his eyes flickered, just for a second. But it was enough, because recognition doesn't lie. You moved her, the investigator said. Not a question, a statement. And statements demand response. I don't remember that. But his voice had changed again. Less certain, less controlled, because memory can blur, but the body remembers. Moments like that don't disappear. They hide until something forces them back. You don't remember or you don't want to say. Silence, but this time it felt thinner, like it might tear. You were in more than one room, the investigator continued. That's not a guess. A long pause. Then, maybe. The words slipped out. Unsteady, uncertain, but real. And just like that, the story expanded. Not by much, but enough. Enough to change the shape of the night. Because now, it wasn't a single moment. It was a sequence. Movement, control, escalation. You said she was yelling, the investigator said. That means she was still conscious. No response. You said you didn't want anyone to hear. Silence. So you moved her. A pause. Then a slow nod. Barely visible, but undeniable. Because the truth was starting to surface, piece by piece. You moved her where? The investigator asked. His eyes dropped again. But this time there was hesitation. Not resistance. Something else. Something closer to recognition. The bedroom, he said quietly. The words settled into the room. Heavy. Because that's where she was found. That's where it ended. And now the path to that room was no longer a mystery. You moved her there, the investigator repeated. Why? I don't know, I didn't want. He stopped. Mid-sentence. Because sometimes the truth reveals itself before the mind can catch it. You didn't want what? The investigator asked. Silence. But charged now. Focused. Because whatever came next would matter. I didn't want anyone to see. There it was. Not panic. Not confusion. Awareness. He knew. Even then he knew. that something had already gone too far. And instead of stopping, he adapted, adjusted, controlled, which changes everything. Because that's not just losing control, that's regaining it in the worst possible way. You were thinking about being seen, the investigator said. No answer. You were thinking about witnesses. Silence. You were thinking about consequences. His breathing shifted again, faster, more shallow, because the picture now was clearer and harder to escape. You moved her to the bedroom, the investigator continued. You closed the space, reduced the noise, kept it contained. No denial, because denial was no longer an option. And then what happened? A long pause, the longest yet, because this was the center, the moment everything turns, where intent, action, and consequence collide. I told you I'd jest. No, the investigator cut in, still calm, but sharper now. You didn't just anything. The word hung there. Just. A word he had used over and over. To shrink. To soften. To distance himself from what really happened. But now it wasn't holding. You moved her, the investigator said. You controlled the situation. You stayed. Silence. You didn't leave when you could have. No response. You didn't stop when you should have. His hands stopped moving again, frozen, because the truth was no longer abstract. It was specific and closing in. What happened in that bedroom? The investigator asked. The question cut through everything. Direct, focused, unavoidable. He didn't answer. Not immediately. But his body did. A slight tremor in his hands. A shift in his posture. A tightening in his jaw. Because this was it. The part he hadn't said. The part he couldn't say. Not without everything collapsing completely. And that's exactly why it mattered. You carried this for 20 years, the investigator said, voice quieter now. You know what happened in that room. Silence. But different now. Not defensive. Not controlled. Fragile. You know how it ended. A long pause. Then, I didn't mean. I'm not asking what you meant, the investigator interrupted. I'm asking what you did. The distinction hit. Hard. Because intention was no longer enough. Not here. Not now. Not after everything else. Another long silence. And then, I covered her mouth. The words came out slow. Broken. But clear. And with them, the story shifted again. Not just holding. Not just grabbing. Silencing. Deliberate. Focused. You covered her mouth, the investigator repeated, to stop her from yelling. A small nod. Trembling now. Because now the truth wasn't just emerging. It was taking shape. And you didn't let go. No answer. But the silence said enough. Because that's the moment. The one he had been avoiding. The one where everything becomes final. You held it there, the investigator said, until she stopped. A tear. Barely there. But visible. Because even after all this time, the memory was still there. Waiting. I didn't know. You knew she wasn't breathing, the investigator said. Not a question. A statement. Because this wasn't confusion. It was recognition. And deep down, he knew it. A long pause. Then, yeah. The word came out in a whisper, but it carried everything. Because now there was no distance left. No version of events that could hide behind I lost control. This was something else. Something clearer. Something darker. He hadn't just reacted. He had acted. With awareness. With purpose. With time to stop. And he hadn't. The room fell silent again. But this time it wasn't waiting. It was settled. Because the truth was finally breaking through. But even now, even with everything he had said, there was still something else. One last piece. something that didn't fit, something that had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight. And whatever it was about to change everything one more time. The room should have felt resolved. The timeline was there, the movement, the escalation. The moment where everything crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. After 20 years, the silence had finally broken into something solid, something investigators could hold on to. But it still didn't sit right. Not completely. Because even now something underneath it all felt unfinished. Not missing in the obvious way, not a name, not a place, not a sequence of events. Those pieces were already in place. It was something deeper, something quieter, something that had been there from the very beginning and somehow avoided every question. Investigators didn't ignore that feeling. They leaned into it. Because instincts like that, after years of cases, patterns, lies, half-truths, they don't come from nowhere. They come from experience, from knowing when a story is technically complete but not entirely true. You said you didn't plan anything, the investigator said again, returning to the beginning, but with a different weight this time. A slow nod, still holding that line. And you didn't bring anything with you. Another nod. Yes, you just knocked on the door. Yeah, you talked. Silence. You argued. A small nod. You grabbed her. You moved her. You covered her mouth. No response. But no denial either. The sequence stood, but something inside it didn't. And then you left. Yeah, the same word, the same tone. But now it sounded thinner, less certain. Because repetition, under pressure, starts to break down. You left her there, the investigator continued, in the bedroom. A pause. Yes. And there it was again. Almost perfect. Almost too perfect. Because the evidence had always suggested something more. Not just in the movement. Not just in the disruption. But in the details. The small things that don't fit into a clean, simple version of events. The things that don't make sense until they do. Investigators shifted, not to the big picture, but to the edges, the overlooked, the details that had never been fully explained. When you left, the investigator asked quietly, "What did you touch?" The question seemed simple, but it wasn't, because this wasn't about the act anymore. It was about the aftermath, the seconds, the minutes. After everything had already happened, he hesitated, longer than expected. I don't know the door, I guess. Just the door. Yeah, too quick, too narrow. Because people don't move through a space like that without leaving a trail, even if they don't realize it. You didn't touch anything else. No. The answer came faster this time, sharper. And that's what made it stand out, because certainty at this stage is rare and often false. Investigators didn't challenge him directly. Instead, they introduced something new, something that had been sitting in the file for years, waiting. There was something else at the scene, the investigator said. A shift, immediate, subtle, but there. Because new information disrupts control. What he asked. Not defensive. Not yet. But alert. Careful. Something that didn't belong to her. Silence. But focused now. Listening. Waiting. A detail we couldn't explain at the time. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not fear. Not panic. But awareness. Because somewhere he already knew. We didn't have a name back then, the investigator continued. We didn't have a match. A pause. Long enough for the weight of the words to settle. But we do now. The room tightened again. Because now it wasn't just about what he had said. It was about what he hadn't. What are you talking about? He asked. And there it was. The first real question from him. Not about the process. Not about the evidence. About the unknown, the thing he hadn't accounted for. Investigators held it for a moment. Let the tension build. Then, there was a second DNA sample. The words dropped clean, controlled, but heavy, because that changes everything. His reaction was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. A flicker, a break, a moment where something inside him shifted fast. That's not, he started, then stopped. Because denial requires certainty. And suddenly, he didn't have it. It wasn't hers, the investigator said. And it wasn't explained by anything you've told us. Silence. But this time it wasn't resistance. It was calculation. Fast, focused, trying to understand, trying to remember, trying to figure out what they knew and what they didn't. You said you were alone, the investigator continued. I was. Quick, immediate, reflex, but weaker now, less solid. Then whose DNA was it? No answer. Because now the story wasn't just under pressure. It was splitting. Because if there was another presence, another person, another contact, then everything changes. The timeline, the intent, the nature of what happened in that house, and more importantly, what he had been hiding. There was no sign of forced entry, the investigator said. No evidence of anyone else coming or going. Silence, but the DNA is there. A pause, heavy, unavoidable. So I'll ask you again. The investigator leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, but closer, more direct. Who else was in that house? No one. The answer came fast, too fast, and now clearly defensive. There was another sample, the investigator repeated. That's not a mistake. You're wrong. The words came out sharper this time, more force behind them. Because this wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about control. And he was losing it. We tested it, the investigator said calmly, more than once. Silence. Because repetition makes things real. Just like before. Twice. Same result. The same line. The same weight. And now the same effect. His breathing changed again. Faster. Uneven. Because this he hadn't prepared for. This wasn't part of the version he had built. This was something else. Something outside of it. Something dangerous. You said you didn't bring anything, the investigator continued. You said you didn't plan anything. You said you were alone. No response. But the evidence says otherwise. Silence. But now it was unstable. Shifting. Because the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. What are you not telling us? The investigator asked. No answer. But his eyes gave something away. A flicker. Not of confusion. Not of surprise. Of recognition. Like a memory trying to surface. Something he hadn't thought about in years. Or something he had tried very hard to forget. You know what this is, the investigator said quietly. A long pause. Then, no, but it didn't land. Not this time. Because the doubt was already there. Visible. Unavoidable. And growing. The room held still. But everything inside it had shifted. Because now this wasn't just a confession. It was a contradiction. And contradictions don't stay contained. They expand. They expose. They force the truth into places it's been hiding. And whatever that second DNA sample meant, whatever it pointed to, it wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It was part of the story. A part he hadn't told. A part he couldn't explain. Or wouldn't. And as the silence stretched again, one thing became clear. The case wasn't just reopening. It was changing. And whatever came next would rewrite everything they thought they knew about that night. The word hung in the air like a fracture that wouldn't seal. Second, DNA. Sample. It didn't just challenge his version of events, it destabilized it. Everything he had set up to this point depended on one thing, that he was alone, that it was a moment, a loss of control, A single line crossed and never intended. But now there was something else in the room. Something that didn't belong to him. And he could feel it closing in. His posture shifted again, more noticeably this time. The calm he had been clinging to began to slip in small, uneven pieces. Shoulders tightening, eyes moving more frequently, breathing no longer steady enough to hide. Because this wasn't just pressure. This was uncertainty. And uncertainty is where control breaks. You're wrong, he said again, but it didn't land the same way. The confidence wasn't there. It sounded thinner now, stretched over something he couldn't quite contain. Investigators didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Because the truth, once introduced, does its own work. We didn't have the tools back then, one of them said quietly. 1998 things were different, limited, slower. But now, a pause. Measured. Precise. We see more. Silence. Because that line doesn't just explain the evidence. It warns. Everything you thought was hidden isn't anymore. His eyes dropped to the table again, but this time they didn't stay still. They moved, unfocused, as if trying to find something solid in a place that no longer had any. You said you were alone, the investigator continued. I was. Still holding it. Still trying. But weaker. And you said you didn't bring anything with you? Yeah. And you said you left after. A pause. Yes. The repetition built the structure again, his version, his narrative. But now it sounded like something being rebuilt in real time, not something remembered. Because the original version had cracks. And now those cracks were spreading. So explain the second DNA, the investigator said. Direct. No space to move around it. No place to hide. He didn't answer. Not immediately. And this time, the silence wasn't resistance. It was conflict. Visible. Because something inside him was trying to reconcile two things that didn't fit anymore. What he had told them. And what they knew. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally. But even he didn't believe it. Not completely. Because the reaction had already said more than the words. Investigators shifted slightly. Not physically, but in approach. Less pressure. More focus. Because this wasn't about forcing a confession anymore. It was about exposing a gap and letting him fall into it. We found it in the bedroom, the investigator said. That detail landed. Hard. Because that's where everything ended. That's where he said it stopped. That's where his version was supposed to be contained. And now it wasn't. His breathing changed again. Faster. Shallower. Because the room was getting smaller. The space between what he said and what was real closing in. You moved her there, the investigator continued. You said that yourself. No response. You were in that room. Silence. Your DNA is there. A pause. And so is someone else's. That was it. The line. Clear. Unavoidable. And this time something broke. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. A shift in his expression. A flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Not denial. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind that comes from memory, not imagination. Because this wasn't new. Not to him. Not really. It had just been buried. Deep. Long enough to feel gone. But not gone. His hands moved again. But differently now. Less controlled. More restless. Because whatever that second sample represented, he knew. Or at least part of him did. You didn't tell us everything, the investigator said quietly. A long pause. Then, I told you what happened. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Because now the story wasn't holding together. Not under this weight. Not all of it, the investigator replied. Silence. You told us what you wanted to remember. That hit. Because memory isn't just about recall. It's about choice. What to keep. what to push away, what to reshape into something survivable. And you left something out? No answer. But his eyes lifted again, slowly, meeting theirs. And this time there was no distance, no detachment, just something raw and steady. Because whatever he had buried was closer now. You said you covered her mouth, the investigator continued. You said you held it there. A small nod, barely there. You said you knew when she stopped. Silence. But you didn't say what happened after that. A pause. Long. Heavy. Because that's the space. The gap. The missing piece. The seconds after everything changes, but before someone walks away. What did you do after she stopped moving? The investigator asked. No answer. But his body reacted. A slight shake of the head. Not denial. More like resistance. To the memory itself. You didn't just leave, the investigator said. Quiet. Certain. You did something else. Silence. But thinner now. Closer to breaking. You were in that room longer than you're saying. His hands tightened again. Harder this time. Knuckles pale. Because now the pressure wasn't external. It was internal. The memory pushing back. You touched something, the investigator continued. You moved something, you left something behind. A pause. Then, I don't. Yes, you do, the investigator cut in, still calm. You were there, you know. And that's when it shifted. Not in words. Not yet. But in him. A visible change. Like something finally reaching the surface after years underwater. His breathing slowed, but not in control. More like resignation, because the distance he had kept for so long was gone. And what was left was the truth, not the version he had shaped, not the one he had survived with, the real one. And it was heavier, darker, more complicated than anything he had said so far. You weren't alone, the investigator said quietly. A long pause, then a shake of the head, but weaker, less certain. You weren't, the investigator repeated. Silence, and then, I didn't see anyone. The words came out uneven. Not a denial, not exactly, but not an admission either. Something in between, unstable. Because now even he wasn't sure what he remembered and what he had buried. You didn't see anyone, the investigator echoed, but someone else was there. No answer. Because now the possibility existed, not just in the evidence, but in his mind. And that changes everything. Because doubt spreads. Once it starts, it doesn't stop. What aren't you remembering? The investigator asked. No response. But his eyes shifted again. Not toward them. Somewhere else. Somewhere inside. Like he was searching. Trying to find something that didn't want to be found. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what he had forgotten. Or forced himself to forget. Because whatever happened in that room was bigger than the version he had been telling. And whatever that second DNA sample meant, it wasn't just evidence. It was a key to something deeper, something buried, something that had been hidden not just from investigators, but from himself. And now, it was coming back. Memory doesn't disappear. It fractures. It bends. It hides in the spaces where the mind feels safest until something forces it back into the light. And now in that room, under the weight of everything that had been uncovered, something inside him was beginning to surface, not clean, not complete, but enough to disturb the version he had held onto for years. He sat there, unmoving, but not still. There's a difference. Stillness is control. This wasn't. His eyes had drifted away from the investigators now, fixed somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the table, beyond the present. As if the room itself had faded, replaced by something older, something darker, something and finished. I didn't see anyone, he said again, but the words felt thinner now, less like a statement, more like something he was trying to convince himself of. Investigators didn't interrupt, because this wasn't about pressure anymore. It was about collapse, the slow unraveling of a story that could no longer hold its shape. You didn't see anyone, the investigator echoed quietly. But something happened in that room after. A long pause, then another, because now time had changed. It wasn't moving forward. It was folding backward, back into that house, back into that bedroom, back into the exact moment where everything had ended and something else had begun. I remember he started, then stopped. The first time he had said those words. Not I don't remember. Not I'm not sure. I remember. And that alone changed everything. What do you remember? The investigator asked, voice low, steady, careful not to break the fragile shift taking place. His fingers moved again, slower now, less restless, almost deliberate. Like he was grounding himself in something physical while his mind went somewhere else entirely. I remember it was quiet. The words came out distant, detached, but real. She stopped yelling, he continued. She stopped moving and it just went quiet. The room held still, because that silence wasn't just absence. It was a moment, a realization, the exact point where everything changes. And then the investigator asked, a pause, long, heavy, because what comes after that silence is the part people don't talk about, the part they bury. The part that stays with them. I didn't move at first, he said. I just stayed there. The image formed slowly. Him in that room. Her on the floor. The air thick with something irreversible. You stayed, the investigator repeated. A nod. Yeah. How long? I don't know. But this time, it felt different. Not avoidance. Not deflection. Just uncertainty. Because time, in moments like that, doesn't behave normally. It stretches, distorts, breaks. What were you thinking? The investigator asked. Another pause. Then, nothing. But it wasn't empty. It was overloaded. Too much to process. Too much to face. So the mind shuts down, protects itself. I just stood there, he said, looking at her. The room seemed smaller now, tighter, because the scene wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, immediate, close. And then I heard something. That's when everything shifted. Again, because that line didn't belong to the version he had told before. Investigators didn't react outwardly, but the moment landed, hard. You heard something, the investigator asked. A slow nod. Yeah. What did you hear? His breathing changed. Not faster, but deeper. Like he was pulling something up from a place he hadn't touched in years. A noise. What kind of noise? A pause. Then, a door. The word dropped into the room like something breaking open, because that changes everything. A door. Not inside his story. Not inside his version. Something else. Something external. You heard a door, the investigator repeated. Yeah. Where? I don't know, somewhere in the house. Silence. But sharp now. Focused. Because this wasn't just memory. This was new. You said you were alone, the investigator said. I thought I was. And there it was. The shift. Clear. Undeniable. From certainty to doubt. You thought you were, the investigator echoed. A nod. Yeah. What happened after you heard it? A long pause, because this was the part he hadn't faced. Not fully. Not until now. I froze, he said. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. The image sharpened. Him standing there, listening, waiting. The house no longer empty. The silence broken. What else did you hear? The investigator asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, steps. Quiet. Measured. Not imagined. Not assumed. Steps. The room shifted again. Because now the story wasn't just about him. There was someone else. Or something. You heard footsteps, the investigator said. Yeah. Coming from where? I don't know, the hallway maybe. His voice was unsteady now. Not with fear, but with recognition. Because the memory was real. And it didn't fit into anything he had told before. What did you do? The investigator asked. I didn't move, he said again. I just listened. A pause. I thought maybe it was nothing. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Not with everything else. Did you see anyone? The investigator asked. A shake of the head. Slow. Uncertain. No. Did anyone see you? Silence. Because that question hits differently. Because now it's not just about presence. It's about witness. About someone else being there. At the exact moment everything ended. I don't know, he said finally. And that answer was the most honest one yet. Because now the certainty was gone. Replaced by something far more dangerous. Possibility. You heard a door, the investigator said. You heard footsteps. A nod. And then what? A long pause. Then, I left. The same ending, but not the same story. Because now it wasn't just him walking away from what he had done. It was him walking away from something else. Something he didn't understand. Something he didn't stay to face. You didn't check, the investigator asked. No. You didn't look? A shake of the head. No. You just left. Yeah. And there it was. The final piece. Not clean. Not complete. But enough. Because now the case wasn't just a closed circle. It was open again. With new questions. New possibilities. And a truth that was far more complicated than anyone had expected. Because if someone else had been in that house, if someone else had heard or seen or moved through those same rooms, then this wasn't just a crime hidden by time. It was a story that had never fully been told. A presence that had never been identified. A second shadow that had existed all along just out of reach. The DNA. The footsteps. The door. Pieces that didn't fit before now forming something new. Something unfinished. And as the room fell silent one last time, the weight of it settled in. Not as closure, but as something else entirely. Because even after 20 years, even after a confession, even after the truth had been dragged into the light, one question remained, unanswered, unsettled, and more haunting than anything that had come before. Who else was in that house? The question didn't fade. It stayed in the room, heavy, unresolved, pressing into everything that had just been uncovered. Who else was in that house? For years, the case had been defined by absence. No witness, no suspect, no clear path forward. Just a body, a silence, and a name that didn't exist. Now there was a name. Now there was a voice. Now there was a version of the truth. And yet the silence hadn't disappeared. It had changed. Because silence, once broken, doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it reveals something deeper hiding beneath it. He sat there, unmoving again, but this time it wasn't resistance, and it wasn't control. It was something closer to exposure. Like the past, once distant and blurred, had come into sharp focus and he couldn't look away anymore. You heard the door, the investigator said quietly, bringing the moment back into the room. You heard footsteps. A slow nod. Yeah. You thought you were alone. I did. The words came out softer now. Less defensive. More uncertain. And you left without checking. Another nod. Because that part, at least, hadn't changed. He had walked away. Not just from what he had done, but from whatever else had been there. And that choice carried weight. Because walking away doesn't erase what happened. It just leaves it behind for someone else to find or for something else to remain. Investigators let the silence stretch again, but this time it wasn't about pressure. It was about understanding, because this case wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't just a man losing control. It wasn't just a crime hidden by time. It was something fractured, something layered. And somewhere inside those layers was a truth that still hadn't fully surfaced. Think about that moment, the investigator said. The door, the footsteps, don't rush it. He didn't respond right away, but his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to show that something was moving behind his eyes, replaying, reconstructing, trying to piece together something that had never made sense. I remember, he said slowly. The words came easier now, not because the memory was clear, but because the resistance was gone. I remember thinking I had to get out. Why? The investigator asked. A pause. Then, because if someone saw me, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the rest was obvious. Everything would collapse. Everything he had done, everything he had tried to leave behind, would be exposed. So you left, the investigator said. Yeah, you didn't stay to see who it was. A shake of the head. No, you didn't try to explain. Another shake. No, you didn't even look. Silence. Because now the weight of that choice was clear. He had chosen escape over truth, and that decision had shaped everything that followed. Years of silence, a case that went cold, a question that never found an answer. Until now. But even now the answer wasn't complete. Because the second presence, whether real, misremembered, or something in between, still existed in the evidence. In the DNA. In the sound of that door. In the footsteps he couldn't unhear. Investigators shifted again. Not to challenge, but to expand. Is there anyone else who could have been there? The investigator asked. He frowned slightly. A small reaction, but genuine. I don't know. Anyone who knew her, anyone who might have come by that night? A pause. Then, no, she lived alone. That part was true. They already knew it. No roommates, no scheduled visitors, no reason for anyone else to be there. And yet, something had been. You said you heard footsteps, the investigator continued. You said it wasn't just in your head. It wasn't. The answer came faster, stronger, because that part he believed, even now, after everything else had shifted. That means someone else was there, the investigator said. Silence, but not resistance. Consideration. Because now the idea wasn't being rejected. It was being processed, slowly, carefully, like something dangerous. Something that could change everything if it were true. Or, the investigator added, it means something else. That line hung in the air. Different. Open. Because not every answer points outward. Sometimes it points inward. His eyes shifted again. Not to the investigators, but away. Somewhere deeper. What do you mean? He asked. Memory isn't perfect, the investigator said. Especially in moments like that. A pause. Fear, stress, adrenaline, they change things. Silence. But you're sure you heard it. A nod. Yeah. And you're sure it wasn't before. Another pause. Then. I think so. Not certainty. Not anymore. Just belief. And belief, under pressure, begins to bend. Because now two possibilities existed. Both real, both dangerous. Someone else had been in that house. Or he had experienced something his mind had reshaped. Something internal. Something tied to the moment itself. Because when the brain reaches a point it can't process, it fills the gap. With sound. With movement. With something that makes sense of what doesn't. Investigators didn't choose one. They didn't need to, because either way the impact was the same. The truth wasn't simple, and it never had been. You left, the investigator said again, and you never went back. A shake of the head. No. You never told anyone. No. You never checked the news to see if anything came out. A pause. Then, I did. That answer came quietly, but it mattered because it showed something else. Awareness, not just of what he had done, but of what might follow. And when you saw it, the investigator asked. Another pause. Long. Heavy. I knew. The words were simple, but final. Because that's the moment. The confirmation. The point where doubt disappears. And reality sets in. You knew she was dead. A nod. Yeah. And you said nothing. Silence. Because there was no answer for that. No justification. No explanation. Just a choice. Made once and carried for decades. The room settled again, but this time it didn't feel unresolved. Not completely, because the truth, or at least most of it, was finally there. Not perfect, not clean, but real. A man who entered a house, a line that was crossed, a life taken, a silence that followed, and a question that lingered. Not about him, but about everything around him. Because even now, with the confession, with the timeline, with the truth pulled from years of darkness, something remained. Not fully explained, not fully understood. A door, a sound, a presence, real or remembered, known or imagined, but there. And that's what stayed with the case. Not just the crime, not just the years it took to uncover it, but the uncertainty that refused to disappear. Because some cases don't end with answers. They end with something else. A shadow, a question, a detail that doesn't fit, and a quiet, persistent feeling that even now, even after everything, there is still something in that house that no one has ever fully seen. The confession didn't close the case. It changed it. For more than 2 decades, the story had been defined by absence, no suspect, no answers, no movement. Then suddenly, everything accelerated. A name, a face, a voice pulling the past into the present with unsettling clarity. And yet, even with all of that, something refused to settle. Because truth, when it finally surfaces, isn't always clean. Sometimes it brings fragments with it, pieces that don't align, details that linger just outside of certainty. And in this case, one detail refused to disappear. The door, the footsteps, the second presence. Investigators didn't dismiss it. They couldn't. Because it wasn't just something he had said in passing. It had weight. It had timing. It had consistency, even as the rest of his story shifted and fractured under pressure. And more importantly, there was still that second DNA sample, unidentified, unresolved, waiting. They went back to the evidence, not as it had been seen in 1998, but as it could be seen now. Stronger tools, sharper analysis, the ability to pull meaning from what once looked like noise. The original sample, his, was clear now, direct, placed inside that house, inside that room, tied to the exact moment everything ended. But the second sample, that was different. Not as strong, not as complete, but present. Enough to raise questions, enough to demand answers. They ran it again and again through expanded databases that hadn't existed back then, millions of profiles. Layers of connections stretching across states, across years, across lives that had never intersected until now. Nothing. No match. No name. Just the same silent result. Unknown. But unknown doesn't mean irrelevant. It means incomplete. Investigators began to widen the scope. Not just the victim. Not just the man who had confessed. but the entire environment surrounding that night. Neighbors, visitors, anyone who might have been in the area, anyone who might have had reason to be near that house at that exact moment. They went back to old interviews, the ones taken in the early days when the case was fresh, when memories were closer, sharper, less distorted by time. And buried in those statements, they found something. Not a clear lead, not a direct connection, but a detail. Small, almost forgotten. One neighbor had reported seeing movement that night. Not clearly, not enough to act on. Just something. A shadow near the side of the house, a light shifting where it shouldn't. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Because it aligned. Not perfectly, but enough. With the sound of a door, with the echo of footsteps, with a presence that had never been accounted for. They revisited the neighborhood. Different now. Years had passed. Houses changed. People moved. Memories faded. But sometimes, something remains. One of the older residents, someone who had lived there long enough to remember, hesitated when asked about that night. Not refusal, not resistance, just hesitation. Like something was there but not fully formed. I remember the police, they said slowly. I remember the lights, the questions. A pause. And I remember thinking something felt off. What do you mean? The investigator asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I don't know, just it didn't feel like just one person. The words were uncertain, but they landed. Because instinct often sees what evidence doesn't. Even if it can't explain it. Even if it can't prove it. It still matters. Investigators didn't treat it as fact, but they didn't ignore it either. Because now the case had shifted again. From a single narrative to a possibility. Not confirmed. Not proven, but present. And that changes how you look at everything. They went back to him. One more time. Not to accuse, not to confront, but to revisit. Because memory, once disturbed, doesn't always settle back into place. Sometimes it opens further. He looked different now. Not physically, but something had changed. The distance he had kept was gone. Replaced by something heavier, more immediate, because now he wasn't just remembering, he was reliving. You told us about the door, the investigator said, about the footsteps. A slow nod. Yeah. You said you didn't see anyone. I didn't. Still holding that. Still certain. Or trying to be. But something was there. A pause. Then, maybe. The word mattered because it wasn't denial. Not anymore. What do you remember about that moment? The investigator asked. He took longer this time. Not resisting. Searching. I remember it felt like I wasn't alone. The room shifted because feeling is different from knowing. It's less precise, but sometimes more honest. You said you heard something. The investigator continued. Yeah. Could it have been something else? A pause. Then, I don't know. And that was the truth. Not the clean kind. Not the definitive kind. But the real kind. Uncertain. Unstable. Human. Because memory, especially under stress, doesn't always separate what happened from what was felt. And in that moment, both existed. Fear. Silence. Awareness. And something else. Something he couldn't fully explain. You left, the investigator said. Yeah. You never went back. No. You never tried to find out. A pause. Then. No. Because some questions are easier to live with unanswered. The room felt quiet again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was something else. Acceptance. Not of a perfect truth, but of an incomplete one. Because sometimes that's all there is. A man who confessed. A life that ended. A silence that lasted for decades. And a detail. that refuses to settle. The second DNA, the sound of a door, the echo of footsteps in a house that should have been empty, real, imagined, or something in between. And that's what stayed. Not just the case, not just the resolution, but the question. Because even now, even after everything, even with the truth finally spoken, there is still one thing no one can say for certain. On that night in 1998, was he ever really alone? Closure didn't come. Not the kind people expect. Not the kind that ties everything together with a clean line and a final answer. What came instead was something quieter, heavier. A resolution built on truth, but shadowed by doubt. The case moved forward. Charges were formalized, statements documented. The confession, fractured but undeniable, became the spine of everything that followed. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the victim's name returned to the surface, not as a fading headline, not as a forgotten file, but as a story finally spoken out loud. And yet, even as the system began to move, something lingered. Because the deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a story that ended cleanly. It was a story that ended partially. Investigators reconstructed the night one final time. Not just through his words, not just through the evidence, but through everything combined: timelines, movements, statements, fragments of memory stitched together into something that resembled the truth. He arrived at the house. He spoke to her. He crossed a line. She told him to leave. He didn't. The argument, the escalation, the movement through the house, the bedroom, the silence, and then that moment, the one that refused to fit neatly into any version, the door, the sound, the footsteps. They tested the house again. Years later, same structure, same layout, same spaces where sound could travel, bend, distort. Investigators walked the rooms, closing doors, opening them, recreating the conditions as closely as time would allow. And they found something. Not an answer, but a possibility. Sound carries differently in confined spaces. A door in one part of the house can echo in another. A shift, a creak, even something small can feel larger than it is. Under stress, under fear, under the weight of what had just happened. The mind fills in gaps. It amplifies. It reshapes. What he heard could have been real, or it could have been something else entirely. But that wasn't the only question, because the second DNA sample remained, unclaimed, unmatched. They ran it again, one more time, through updated systems, expanded databases, cross-referenced with every available profile that had entered the system over the years. Still nothing. No identity. No connection. Just the same result. Unknown. And unknown is where things linger. Investigators explored every angle. Could it have been contamination? Possibly. But the sample had been collected carefully, preserved properly, handled within protocol. Could it have been transferred DNA? A trace brought in indirectly, carried on clothing, on contact, from somewhere else. Also possible. Science allows for that, explains it, but doesn't confirm it. And then there was the third possibility, the one that stayed just out of reach, that someone else had been there, not seen, not heard clearly, not identified, but present. A shadow moving through the same space, at the same time, leaving behind only the faintest trace. Investigators couldn't prove it, but they couldn't fully dismiss it either. And that's where the case settled. Not in certainty, but in tension between what is known and what isn't. The community felt it too, because the story didn't end with the arrest. It spread through conversations, through questions, through the quiet realization that something had happened in that house that no one could fully explain. For years, it had been a mystery without a face. Now, it was something else, a truth with an edge. Because knowing what happened doesn't always mean understanding everything about it. And sometimes the details that remain unresolved are the ones that stay the longest. He sat in custody now, no longer hidden, no longer blending into the background of a life built on silence. Just a man facing what he had done and everything he hadn't said. Because even after the confession, even after the reconstruction, there were still moments he couldn't fully account for. Still gaps. Still that one detail that wouldn't settle. The door. The sound. The footsteps. Sometimes he said it must have been nothing. Just noise. Just fear. Just his mind reacting to what had already happened. Other times, he wasn't so sure. And that uncertainty stayed. Because memory doesn't always give clear answers. It gives impressions, fragments, pieces that don't always fit together the way we want them to. And when those pieces involve something that was never fully seen, never fully understood, they don't disappear. They remain in the background, quiet, unresolved. The case closed on paper, but not completely, not in the way people expect. Because even now, there is still one part of that night that no one can fully explain. Not the investigators, not the evidence, not even the man who was there. And that's what lingers. Not just the crime, not just the years it took to uncover it, but the shadow that remains just beyond the edge of certainty. A detail that refuses to fade. A presence that may have never been there, or may have been there all along. And in the end, that is what makes this case different. Not just a cold case solved, but a story that leaves something behind. Something unanswered. Something that stays with you long after the truth has been told. Some cases end with a door closing. This one ends with a door that may have opened. That's what people remember. Not just the crime, not just the years it took to uncover it. Not even the confession that finally gave the victim a voice again after decades of silence. It's that one detail. The sound, the moment, the possibility that, even at the center of everything, there was something else. Time moved on. It always does. Court dates replaced interrogation rooms. Legal language replaced raw admissions. What had been spoken in fragments, pauses, and broken sentences was translated into structured testimony, organized, formal, stripped of the tension that had filled that room. But something was lost in that translation. Because the truth, as it had emerged, wasn't clean. It wasn't linear. It didn't fit perfectly into statements or timelines. It carried weight in the spaces between words, in what was said and what wasn't. The confession held. It didn't collapse. Even under scrutiny, it remained consistent in the places that mattered most. Presence, contact, action. The sequence that led to a life ending in that bedroom in 1998. That part was no longer a mystery, but everything around it still lingered. The second DNA sample was filed, documented, stored, just like it had been years before. Except now, it meant something different. Before, it was a question without context. Now, it was a question that existed alongside an answer. And that made it harder to ignore. Investigators didn't stop looking. Even after the case was technically resolved, even after the system moved forward, the file didn't close completely. Because something about it resisted closure. They ran the sample again months later. Then again. Each time hoping that the expanding databases, new profiles, new connections, new entries into the system might finally produce a match. Each time, nothing. Just the same quiet result. Unknown. And unknown in a case like this doesn't fade. It echoes. Because every confirmed detail only sharpens the one that isn't. Every answer makes the unanswered question louder. And that question remained exactly where it had been from the moment it surfaced. Who else was there? The neighborhood returned to normal, at least on the surface. People moved in and out. Houses changed ownership. Time smoothed over the edges of what had happened the way it always does. But some stories don't disappear. They settle. They become part of the place. Not always spoken out loud, but felt. In the quiet. In the way certain details are remembered even when everything else fades. The house itself stood and changed in structure, but not in meaning. Because once something happens in a place like that, it doesn't leave. Not completely. It becomes part of the walls, part of the air, part of the silence. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, people think about it. Not the full story, just pieces, a headline, a rumor, a question that never found an answer. The man at the center of it all no longer lived in that quiet space between anonymity and normal life. His name was known now, his actions recorded, his voice captured in transcripts that would exist long after he was gone. And yet, even he didn't have all the answers. That's what made it different. Because most confessions bring clarity. This one brought something else. A gap. A space where certainty should have been but wasn't. He had gone back over it, again and again. The night, the moment, the silence, the sound. Each time trying to fix it into something solid, something explainable. Sometimes he told himself it was nothing, just a noise, just his mind reacting to what had already happened. A natural response to stress, to fear, to the realization of what he had done. But other times, he wasn't so sure, because the memory didn't feel imagined. It didn't feel distant or distorted. It felt real, close, immediate, like something that had been there, just out of sight. And that's what stayed with him. Not just the act, not just the consequence, but the uncertainty. Because even after everything, even after the truth had come out, there was still one part of that night that didn't belong to him. Investigators reached the same place in their own way. They had the evidence. They had the confession. They had the timeline. But they also had that one detail. The second DNA, unidentified, unresolved, and no matter how many times they reviewed it, retested it, reconsidered it, it remained exactly what it had been from the beginning. A fragment, a trace of something that didn't fit. They considered every explanation, contamination, transfer, error, each one possible, each one supported by science, but none of them proven. And so the case settled into something rare, not unsolved, not fully solved, something in between. A story where the central truth is known, but the edges remain blurred. And sometimes, those edges are what stay with people the longest, because certainty brings closure, but uncertainty lingers. Years from now, the details will fade, the dates, the names, the exact sequence of events, but that one question will remain, passed from one telling to the next, quietly, almost as an afterthought, but never fully gone. On that night in 1998, in that house, in that final moment of silence, when everything had already happened, and the world should have been still, was there someone else standing just out of sight? Or was it something else entirely? Something that existed only in that moment, in that mind, in that space between action and realization? No one can say for certain. Not the man who was there. Not the investigators who rebuilt it piece by piece. Not the evidence, even after decades of progress. And maybe that's what makes it unforgettable. Not just a cold case brought back to life. Not just a hidden truth finally uncovered, but a story that refuses to end cleanly. A story that leaves something behind, something unresolved, something that doesn't disappear when the lights go out and the room falls silent. Because some cases don't end with answers. They end with a feeling. A quiet, persistent sense that even after everything has been said, there is still something there, waiting, unseen, unanswered, and maybe never meant to be fully understood.